And then I'm like, you know what? It's the only thing that makes sense. It always made sense. Of course, this is what's going on. 11 years I've had this pain, and it's the only thing that makes sense.
Welcome back to the world's tightest community. Carli Cutchin spent 15 years with Pudendal neuralgia doing everything right. The PT, the medications, the trauma therapy, the rest. Some of it provided temporary relief, but what nobody told her until year 11 was that her nerve was physically trapped and that there was a surgery that could address what conservative treatment never fully could. Carli is a writer and disability advocate with a background as a comparative literature scholar, and she's genuinely one of the sharpest people I've had the pleasure of talking to on this podcast. We go into her full story and the surgery she wishes she'd known about much earlier, but we also dig into the ideas underneath it in terms of how medicine frames chronic pain and what Carli sees as the cost of those frameworks for women specifically. Her constructivist perspective on all of this really stuck with me, and I think you'll really love this one. Welcome, Carli. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So before we dive into your story, which is a very powerful one, can you tell us briefly just who you are and what your background is?
Yeah. So I'm Carli Cutchin. I live in Berkeley, California, and I've lived here for a long time. I was born and raised in Northern California, and I have a kind of scattered background, or not scattered, but I've done a lot of things. I worked early on as a journalist and a university communications writer before going to graduate school for comparative literature. And so I've taught university. I have written academic articles and cultural criticism. But what I've been doing for the last maybe 4 or 5 years is really disability advocacy. I write about disability. I've written for disability, about disability for organizations like Dame Magazine and Ms. Magazine, among others. And, I post on Instagram. I'm in contact almost every day on Instagram with often women who have vulvovaginal disorders and especially pudendal neuralgia. So because I myself am still live with a lot of limitations, despite the fact, I've gotten a lot better, but I'm still living with limitations. So I'm happy to be able to do this kind of advocacy work from my home part-time. I'm very happy to be in a position where I can do that. And the other thing about me is that I left a PhD program many years ago, really for disability reasons. And now I'm feeling well enough to go back. And that's at UC Berkeley in comparative literature. So I'm excited about that. I'm nearly done then with my PhD. And I also just wrote a memoir, which is really about my relationship with my mother and delayed grief in the wake of a kind of enmeshed relationship. So I've spent a lot of my last few years working on that.
I think you bring something really unique to this topic, being someone with an academic background, specifically as a scholar of comparative literature, and then also someone with real lived experience of pelvic pain, and the kind of intellectual lens you bring to thinking about systems and discourses that surround these conditions is something I find really intriguing. And that's how I first came across you and your work, through the brilliant articles you've written on your story and your views on and critique of the biopsychosocial model in practice, which I found really interesting. So I'm very grateful to be speaking with you today. So can you start by telling me a bit about your background with pelvic pain and essentially your story with pelvic pain?
Yeah. So, and the information I sent you, I called, my story a 15-year-old battle with pudendal neuralgia and pudendal nerve entrapment in 4 acts. I could divide it into 10 acts or 3 acts. It's just a kind of way of organizing 15 years, which is a long time to struggle with any kind of malady. And I have trouble actually with the word battle, but I'm going to use that as a kind of placeholder word. So I will just begin at the beginning with the onset of my pain, which I think as for many, was very confusing. Um, it began in spring 2011, and I was 34. and I had just started in my graduate program at UC Berkeley. And I'd been dating this really wonderful man for about a year. He was from Miami. So that spring break in March, he'd invited me to travel with him to South Beach to see his mother. And it started out as just a really lovely trip. We had these juicy steak dinners. We went for long ocean swims. Like, I love to swim.
Hmm.
And we had cocktails on Lincoln Road. It was really magical. And then what happened is we were staying at the Days Inn and we had sex and it was uncomfortable for me. It was painful. And, with this person, I'd had no trouble in that department. So I think what a lot of women would think, I must have a UTI.
Hmm.
Despite the fact that I never had a UTI before, but I figured I must have one. So when we got back home, I went to my student health center and I got tested twice for a UTI because, of course, I really wanted to have a UTI instead of mysterious pain. And those tests came back negative. So at this time, I was a graduate student. I was just beginning coursework and it was very busy. And the pain was only there during sex. So it was something I could really compartmentalize in my life.
Hmm.
As I went to classes, I wrote my seminar papers. I made plans for to spend a summer in Berlin, working on my German there. And then I did not pursue further medical care until the end of the semester. And that was
That
right
was about
before I was.
a year afterwards.
No, it was a few months.
Few months.
So
Okay.
it was, yeah, like maybe 2 or 3 months. And so I went back to my student health center and I saw this very matter of fact doctor who examined me. She's like, everything looks fine down there. And I think a lot of us have had someone say, everything looks fine down there.
Yeah.
And then she said something that would really ring in my ears for years and years to come. She said, pelvic pain is the black box of gynecology. And at the time, I was really only vaguely aware of what a black box was. It was something that, when a plane crashes in the ocean, everyone's trying to recover the black box to find out what really happened. And so I was like, is this woman saying that I'm like a plane crash? And, you have to dive basically metaphorically to the bottom of the ocean to find out what's wrong with me. I actually think that's a great metaphor for what was going to happen. Um, so she sent me for an ultrasound, and it wasn't until I was literally about to board the plane for Berlin that I got her message on a voicemail saying the ultrasound indicates that I have adenomyosis, word I'd never heard before. She explained it was like endometriosis and that pelvic floor physical therapy could be helpful. The only cure was a hysterectomy. So I was, 34 years old. I wanted a baby and I was about to board a plane for Berlin. I was there with my boyfriend and I received like on a voicemail, this really unsettling news that included the word hysterectomy. So I was pretty dismayed. I boarded the plane, probably drank a lot of wine on the plane, and then got settled in Berlin. And within the first week or two, I was sitting in my room, doing some research. And then I started just hurting out of the blue. And this was the first time I'd had pain that wasn't pain with sex.
Hmm.
And it just came on. It felt like someone had put a cattle prod in my vagina and was shocking me over and over again. And other times it felt like there was barbed wire in there. My
Hmm.
pain has always been vaginal. So it was very, very crazy making, the nature of the pain itself. And then also the thought that my pain was accelerating at such a point that in my mind it was like, oh, I'm going to have a hysterectomy tomorrow or something. It
Hmm.
was really scary. But I kind of stuck out my trip in Berlin. And then when I got home, I did the next step, which my gynecologist had recommended, which is to start a pelvic floor physical therapy. At this point, I hadn't even known that there was such a thing as pelvic floor. Or maybe a yoga instructor had said it, but I'm like, what kind of word is that? And I didn't know that I had a pelvic floor or that it does so many things, that it supports us, it holds us up, it is responsible, obviously for bowel and urinary and sexual function. All of these um, roles that it plays, kind of didn't think about. So the Felt the pelvic floor physical therapist, to her credit, was really lovely. She had a really just a gentle manner, and she kind of began with a very gentle vaginal exam, which I could not tolerate. I actually
Mm.
broke down sobbing when she began like the vaginal exam and could not really even complete it, I think. Afterwards, she had questions for me. So she asked me questions like, does it hurt to sit? I said, well, it hurts all the time. But yeah, actually, come to think of it, it does hurt worse when I sit. And then she said, does a toilet seat feel better? And I was like, what kind of question is that? Then I thought about it. And yes, a toilet seat feels better. And then she wanted to know about my history of cycling. And I said, well, the previous year I'd biked 1,000 miles down the California coast with some friends. I regularly did 5-mile bike rides in the Berkeley Hills. I rode to school. I'd ridden about around Berlin all summer. And then she said, Carli, I think you might have pudendal neuralgia. That is a condition that means that you have some kind of pain or irritation along the pathway of the pudendal nerve, which innervates bladder, bowel, sexual function, kind of the external genitalia, the clitoris, lower vagina, penis and scrotum in men, as I understand it. And she said that the typical symptoms include pain with sitting, pain with sex, and that cycling can irritate the pudendal nerve.
Mm.
She said, well, I'm not saying you'll never bike again, but I was like, shit, because like biking was one of my great pleasures. So it was just
Mm.
really crushing to hear this. First my like sexual life is compromised, and then my favorite pastime is compromised, and I'm having all of this pain. So I did what any kind of normal, sane 34-year-old would do, and just try to ignore all of this, try to like compartmentalize and repress it. I did go to physical therapy every week with her. And then otherwise I continued mostly to like live my life, go to classes. I did stop biking, and I did not get better in any way, even with pelvic floor physical therapy and that I'd stopped biking. So then after, I think again in between semesters. So I usually kind of clustered my medical questing at breaks. That
Mm.
winter, I saw a pelvic floor, a physician specialist. And so she administered pudendal nerve blocks, which are sort of the gold diagnostic standard for pudendal neuralgia. And I had a positive one, meaning I got complete relief with a Marcaine nerve block. And then she also administered at the same time a steroid nerve block. And that did give me like several weeks of relief, which is great. She did a couple of rounds of those, but the pain always came roaring back. And so now at this point, it's like a year and a half into my pain. I wanted to have a baby. And I was out of, I felt, reasonable options that medicine had given me. I also took some vaginal Valium in that time, which did help, but it made me very woozy. So I was just really miserable. And during this time, I also wanted to start trying for a baby. And my boyfriend and I did have unprotected sex whenever we could around my ovulation time if I wasn't in excruciating pain. But most of the time, it hurt too much to try. I would say the first glimmer of improvement came maybe a year and a half after my onset of symptoms, which I scaled back physical activity and learned to rest more. So in consultation with my physical therapist, I stopped the vigorous yoga I was doing, and I stopped rock climbing in the gym. I always felt great during these activities. And in fact, I always felt great when I was on a bike. It was afterwards that I would flare. Aside from gentle walking, I eliminated all physical activities. And I would say, it's hard to say, but I got maybe 10 to 20% better as a result of that. And then at this point, as the 2-year anniversary as the onset of my pain neared, I had a talk with myself, and I said, like, I want to have a baby, right? And this isn't working, right? Whatever I'm doing, I'm not healing. There's no way I can get pregnant with the pain at this level. And certainly I would have no idea how to raise a child with this level of pain. So something needed to give. And I decided to take a semester off of school and do a lot of rest and also to do some work on myself. Because at this point, I had a therapist who kept asking about my mother. And this was really annoying to me, but I had never come to terms with the history of trauma that I had and the history of grief. And the pain really brought it up for me, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So I also knew I needed to do some work on myself. Couldn't do that if I was teaching classes, if I was taking classes. So I decided to take a semester off of school. I told this to my cognitive behavioral therapist at the time, who looked at me and he said, Carli, if you're not being productive, I don't think you'll be happy. You should stay in school. He was ridiculous, and I see that now.
Hmm.
The other thing I did around this time is I went for the first time to see Dr. Jerome Weiss, who was really just an amazing, pioneering pelvic pain doctor who was at the time at the forefront of non-invasive pudendal neuralgia treatments. And he did this really gentle internal vaginal trigger point therapy that was somehow worked much better than what my physical therapist had been doing. So, uh, as of 2 years after the onset of my symptoms, between rest and weekly sessions with him, I could go, I would say, a couple days without pain. So that was the first breakthrough that I'd had in that time.
Hmm.
So that is the end of my act one, and I can keep going, but you might have questions, or it might be a lot to take in, or there might be something that's unclear. So I'm happy to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you, Carly, and thank you for sharing so openly and in such detail. I have to say, like, a lot of what you were saying there, the first part of your story made me incredibly emotional. And I'm just really, really sorry for how much this impacted your life. It's really heartbreaking to hear. The first thing that I wanted to pause on was this, and I can't pronounce it, adenomyosis,
Adenomyosis, yeah.
adenomyosis diagnosis, which I think you mentioned before, looking back, didn't really fit your symptoms. Do you know now
Yeah.
why that was the conclusion she landed on? Like, was that something you were going to call it just derived from your ultrasound, or do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I'd forgotten a little bit to follow up on that. So adenomyosis, it didn't occur to me at the time to make the link that my symptoms were not cyclical. So adenomyosis is where the uterine lining grows, I think, on the uterine wall.
Hmm.
So it's similar to endometriosis. And its symptoms really, they began, I think, at least cyclically and often with heavy bleeding. And I did not have those symptoms at all. So it really was an incidental diagnosis. And I still had in the back of my mind for a long time that adenomyosis could be contributing to my symptoms, but my pelvic floor physical therapist didn't think so. And then by the time I saw my first pelvic pain doctor, we really just zeroed in on pudendal neuralgia.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So you've at this point, roughly 2 years in, you've had this diagnosis of pudendal neuralgia. You've done a lot of pelvic floor PT. You've met this Dr. Weiss, who seems to be promising in terms of starting to treat your symptoms, and you're beginning to get some relief, if I understand, but you're also scaling back your life significantly to get there. What happened next? Did you start seeing some relief from the work you were doing there with him?
I did around the same time. Sometimes I think it's hard to pinpoint if you get like, 30% relief from this modality and 30% from this other
Yes.
modality when you're doing everything at the same time, right? So in early 2013, what happened was I began treating the pain from multiple new angles, from an angle of like rest and scaling back activity, from Dr. Weiss, from taking a semester off. And then the next chapter of my journey was one that was very emotional and trauma focused.
Hmm.
So I could go in a little bit to
Yes,
that.
that'd be
And
helpful.
it's interesting. One of the reasons I want to narrate this part of my journey is that later, much later, I will be accused of a psychogenic pain that has a psychogenic origin, a fear of movement, and those kinds of things. And an absolute cornerstone of my journey is that I actually spent years going really deep into mind body therapy and got as far as I could with that. And so much later, when the medical community had began to suspect there was this psychogenic origin of my pain, I knew that couldn't be true because I'd gone so far with somatic mind body healing modalities for myself, right? So if it works for you, I'll share a little bit more about that. So we're still in kind of February 2013, 2 years after the onset of my pain. And I spent 3 weeks at a retreat center on the California coast taking intensive trauma and somatic meditation workshops. This is not something I would have been able to afford, but my boyfriend generously paid for it. And there was one workshop in particular that broke everything open for me. And here I want to backtrack and say just a little bit about my childhood. And I was raised to have very intense shame around sexuality. My mom homeschooled me for 9 years, in large part actually to protect me from sex education, which in her mind would lead to sex, pregnancy, abortion, being ostracized from the community. And she herself had a traumatic background around all of this. When she was 20 in 1965, she had to surrender a child for adoption as an unwed single mother. She also had sort of back alley abortions. She was abused by men. She had so much shame and fear around sexuality. She really wanted to keep me safe. So I was so determined to rise to the occasion of keeping myself safe and really keeping myself a little girl, like her little girl, that when I got my period at 13, I hid it from her. I was mortified. I did not ever want to get my period. I hid it from her and everyone else for 5 years. And she found out finally when I was 18. And she never asked if I was getting my period during this time. I used actually like wadded up toilet paper to instead because I didn't have tampons or pads. And so that's just one example of the way I was raised to fear my own body and my own sexuality. As an adult, I worked very hard to embrace sexuality, to feel comfortable about my body. And by the time, I met my boyfriend, who I talk about here, I had, and that was a great joy in my life. And then pudendal neuralgia struck. So it felt like this, what Freud calls the return of the repressed. It felt like a judgment on my very being that was somehow an extension of the shame I'd known when I was a child and a teenager. It was very triggering for me. And for this reason, I knew that I had to explore my relationship with my mother and the grief that she died of addiction-related disease when I was in college. I think some listeners to this might know that pudendal, the word pudendal, comes from the Latin and means that of which one ought to be ashamed.
Mm.
When I heard this, when I read that for the first time, I'm like, yes, some people want to change the name. And I'm kind of like, actually, it's perfect from my point of view.
Hmm.
So what happened at the retreat center, and if anyone knows, this is Esalen Institute in Big Sur. I took one workshop in particular, led by this incredible somatic therapist named Susan Aposhin. There were maybe a dozen workshop participants sort of witnessing each other.
Hmm.
And I learned in that workshop to really feel into my body, to feel like my gut and my heart and my spine and my pelvis, to feel the physical sensation, and then also to be aware of the emotional sensation and to connect the two,
Hmm.
and to tell my story in a way that was very embodied to other listeners. It was extremely intense. At one point, I sobbed in someone's arms for a full hour. I decided I needed to get really big and to kind of shout and scream and roar and almost like to become this wild animal. Like it was very, very intense. And if an outsider had come, I would have looked nuts. But it was so beautiful.
Hmm.
Really, I tapped into my rage. And rage I found was a great counter to shame. It's like shame is very contracting, right? And rage is huge. I think so many more women, gender nonconforming people, like we need to get big, right? And we need to feel that rage.
Mm.
And and I worked, I worked through the trauma. I worked through the shame by getting big and by doing that in front of others, which is a key piece. Witnessing is so key, having others, because my childhood was very isolated and it was just me and my mom in our mobile home. So to have our experience witnessed was very powerful. I came back from this workshop really a changed person. I was at the retreat center for a few weeks. Very lucky to be able to do so. Obviously, this is not something most people can do. Very, very lucky. At home, I began an embodied meditation practice, really feeling into my body, cycling through sensations, becoming a kind of bear. One time I walked around my neighborhood pretending that I was a bear with like my claws out and I had no shoes on. It was amazing. It was great. And once again, I want to stress this was all coming from me. I knew I needed to do this. I was not being told by the medical community, like, you need to go and be a bear if you want to heal. This was all coming from me and it had to come from me, right? For my own reasons, no matter what, health or no health, I had to confront my past. So now, it's spring 2011 or 2013. I have my embodied meditation practice. I have the ability now to feel into my body and know when I need rest. I'm taking time off school. I'm seeing Dr. Weiss every week. I'm now going days without pain, like many days without pain. And in May that year, I got pregnant. And because I was feeling good enough to have sex. And then at our first ultrasound visit, we found out that it was twins. And I was like, holy shit, I can't have twins. I can't take it. Like, my belly's going to get so big. Like, we don't know how pregnancy will affect my pudendal neuralgia. So it was, yeah. But it was also a really exciting time.
Mm.
And pregnancy was okay. As my belly got bigger, I did need to scale back physical activity even more. I was still going to see Dr. Weiss. He was still doing very gentle internal releases. And yeah, pregnancy was for the most part okay.
Mm.
Dr. Weiss told me to have a C-section because the pudendal nerve innervates the pushing in labor. And I was like, yes, please, that I am no way are these babies going to come out my vagina after all it's been through. That is not going to be a thing.
So that was going to put more pressure on the pudendal nerve if you were to give birth vaginally.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I did receive conflicting information on this, but I
Mm.
trusted Dr. Weiss and I trusted my own body to, like, I just kind of knew that it wasn't like it wasn't some kind of dream of mine to have a so-called natural birth. I don't think
Mm.
there is such a thing as a natural versus unnatural birth, but right, like I wanted to do whatever would be right for my own body.
Mm.
And I will say that my experiences with pudendal neuralgia absolutely taught me as a pregnant person and as a young mother to block out all the noise and do what was right for me. You'll hear so many pieties, I feel like, especially in the Bay Area, like have this kind of diet and breastfeed for this amount of time and have a home birth and have a water birth and sleep with your baby and wear your
Mm.
baby and so on. And I was just like, okay, that's all noise. I need to do what's right for me and my body as a mother.
Mm.
My daughters were born. They were great. They're healthy. They're identical twins. And after delivery, we got a lot of help. Had a lot of people around. My boyfriend took time off work. I took another semester off of school. And it was really sweet. My body actually continued to get better after delivery. Once I had lost that weight, I really bounced back. And once again, I could go like days or weeks without pain. I always had to be very careful sitting. No more than say like a minute on a hard seat ever. So that includes like a concrete or wood, a soft seat, maybe an hour, right? Only very gentle physical activity, walking, maybe some free form dance. And really, the next 6 years kind of look like this. I raised my daughters. I went back to school, taught classes. I was able then to hike, which was great. Still had to be very careful with sitting. and every like few weeks to a few months, I would say every few months, I did flare.
Mm.
And the flare would come on with a sensation of extreme weakness in my pelvic floor and my vagina. That was how I knew it was coming. And that was my signal to rest. So I would actually kind of go be bedridden for like a few days, mostly bedridden. And I would see Dr. Weiss again, and then I would bounce back and would just kind of be living my life. I had a standing desk. I had a lot of modifications. Any dinner party that I had with, my boyfriend, then husband, and friends, I would book a table at a restaurant that had like a high counter or like a high table, so everyone else could sit at a stool and I could stand. So there were a lot of modifications, but I was really living, strangely enough, I feel like I was living my best life because I'd been able to have two daughters, two kids. We'd planned on one child. I was mostly not in pain. I got to be a mom. I got to teach English. And I had this relationship to my body and to my past, which was very empowering, right? That I wasn't afraid of my body. I could tap into it. I could explore its sensations. So it was very, I felt very much like I'd had a huge part in healing myself. And so then in 2020, everything changed again. And I went into a flare that I could not come out of. Once again, I've said a lot. So I don't know if we should pause here a little bit and process.
Yeah, let's pause a bit. And there's so much that you've just talked about, which I would love to cover. What I would like to start with is what you shared around shame really resonates with me personally, and the opposition between shame and rage. I've also worked a lot with both of those, done similar work that you did in that workshop. And I know from my own experience that untangling those layers, especially when they're connected to sexuality, is, at least in my experience, incredibly painful. So I want to say thank you for raising that, because I think it is, I keep coming back to, I think, the same conclusion as you, that women need to connect to their rage a lot more than we currently are, because there's a lot of power in it and a lot of energy in it. And I think you put it so beautifully again, how it is kind of the counter to shame. So I appreciate that you brought that up. Yeah, and to the point around shame again, you mentioned this fact that pudendal, the word, derives from that of which one ought to be ashamed. I thought it was really interesting what you said about you that you agreeing with, yes, of course, that's the right meaning of that word. I'm assuming that's changed now, or how do you view the power of the language there now?
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's a very personal thing. I know that there are, so like Rachel E. Gross is an amazing journalist who
Yeah,
writes about women's health,
I'm reading her
did
book
a
now.
Oh, yeah, it's great. I interviewed her for Ms. Magazine, so that was really fun. And so she did a story in the New York Times a few years ago talking about, pudendal means shame, and there's a young doctor who was trying to change that. And of course, I applaud those efforts. I would say for me personally, I see it in descriptive and not prescriptive terms. Like, it doesn't have to mean shame, but it does name what for me has been my experience. It names the cultural weight of having pain in this place.
Mm.
So I have found it very resonant as a writer. It's great material. So should we change the name? Like, maybe, but I personally think it just makes so much sense, and there's almost this comfort in it knowing that, like, oh, it's not just me, right? There's a long, for hundreds of years now, this is how culture has been seeing it. So it's not just me, and I'm not alone in seeing this shame. It is cultural, and in that way, in an odd way, it's validating.
Yeah, okay, now I understand more what you mean. I think I agree with you in that for me, it's also been resolving in some ways, trying to understand more about the cultural and the history historical roots of generally women's sexuality, the role of women in society, because I think to some degree it helps to contextualize the feelings that I've felt going through this type of pain. Yeah, I agree with you. I think in some ways it does bring some consolation, but still, it still pisses me off.
Yeah. I absolutely hear that for sure.
Yeah. But okay. So you mentioned that you had this 6-year period roughly where you got pregnant with twins, gave birth, that was successful C-section, and you were having a period where you were managing your symptoms by being very conscious of resting when you needed to, going to these weekly, were you still doing the weekly sessions with the
When
doctor
I
who
was
was
in a
able to help
flare.
you?
I would go when I
When you
was
were
in
in
a
a flare.
flare.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so you just left us at a bit of a cliffhanger that
Mhm.
it started to deteriorate from there. You started experiencing a flare that you just couldn't recover from. So what
Yeah.
started happening there?
So this is when I really got pudendal neuralgia.
Hmm.
I know it sounds like I had it before, but I had no idea what was coming. It began during COVID lockdown, May 2020. And my daughters were 6 now. My daughter Althea had just gotten a bike with training wheels, and I had a friend's bike in the basement. And I was like, I'm doing so well. But we'll look a ride around the neighborhood. What's the harm? It would be so fun. So I got on a bike for 15 minutes. It was a beautiful spring day. There was a breeze. It was sunny. I had a lovely time, felt fine when I was in the bike afterwards. And actually, my daughter, Althea, she was like, Mom, you really need to get off that bike. I know your history. And after I got off the bike, my pelvis had that very familiar weak feeling, weakness more than pain. And it was kind of the situation of like my pelvis isn't holding me up, like the muscles aren't holding me up.
Hmm.
This feeling persisted then for months. So I scaled back activity. Dr. Weiss had since retired, so I couldn't go to him. And of course, there was barely any healthcare available in 2020 anyway. So I thought that I would just rest and I would get better. But it's beginning of 2021 rolls around. I was not getting better. I went to a clinic, a PT clinic that was just around the corner from me. So it was an office of pelvic health and rehabilitation center. And I really respect the work they do, but I will say that those sessions sent me into a tailspin that was really bad. And I was bedridden after that. 2021 and 2022 were then the hardest years of my life. And I had a lot of shitty years as a teenager and in my 20s. Even standing, walking a few steps caused 10 out of 10 pain. So that like barbed wire in the vagina sensation. I just had incredible weakness in the pelvis, stayed in bed almost all the time, lying on my left side because my right side was more impacted, had worse pain, or I was in a scalding hot bath, which helps a little bit. And I will say, I felt so cheated. I had worked so hard to be healthy, to heal from, to learn from pudendal neuralgia. And I kept thinking of this creepy line from David Lynch's Twin Peaks. It was like, it's happening again. And there's this terrible, kind of senseless, uncanny return.
Hmm.
The pain had always felt like this judgment on my very being, like I had been chosen in the worst way for some mysterious sin I didn't remember. And I also thought of Joseph K. and Kafka's The Trial, which is a book I love. I love Kafka. And you have this character who's facing judgment for a crime that was never named and he never remembers committing. I felt like Joseph K. And that book actually ends with the words, he felt as though the shame would outlive him.
Hmm.
So now I really embarked on a quest to get better. And I had to start really at ground zero. So I got more steroid nerve blocks, and this time they didn't work. Trigger point injections, a pelvic floor Botox. None of that worked at all. I got, for the first time, actually, I got an MRI that showed nothing except for what seemed at first to be a Tarlov cyst, but that turned out to be an incidental diagnosis. I began a very high dose of gabapentin, which seemed to help at first, but I think stopped working. And yet I was so desperate for something, I stayed on it for 18 months. And I had memory problems for 2 years after stopping it. I'm not a fan of gabapentin. I had these nausea-inducing ketamine infusions at a clinic that turned out to be run by a felon, which is a whole story in itself. I was outfitted with a dorsal root ganglion stimulator at UCSF. And what that is they put this kind of machine in your like lower sacrum, upper butt, that's supposed to interrupt pain signals. And, it works for some people, but it just made it worse for me. When I did leave the house, I used a wheelchair because my pelvis was so weak. And I would tuck my left leg under my butt, which actually took pressure off my right butt. So I could, I would be in the wheelchair for maybe 15 minutes at a time if I needed to get somewhere. And I mean, my life, I had 6 and 7-year-old daughters or 7-year-old daughters at this point, and my life had just fallen apart. It was, I mean, there's no words to explain how horrific this was. I kept going though. I made an appointment with Dr. Hibner in Arizona. Known his name for a long time. I knew he was a world expert. I knew that he was sort of known for performing pudendal decompression surgery, which I did not think I had pudendal entrapment. And I I didn't drive. My friend and I drove 700 miles down to see him. We rented a van with a mattress in the back, and then I laid down in the back and she drove. We listened to true crime podcasts on the way. It was very sweet. Like one of the beautiful things about this time in my life is my friends really, really came through. And I'm very lucky to have an amazing support network as well as financial resources. So Dr. Hibner, I consulted with him. He took a very, very careful patient history. And then he said something awful. He said, "Carli, I think you have pudendal nerve entrapment." And I said, "No, I don't. That is not possible. I got better before." Of course I didn't get completely better before. I still couldn't sit, for very long, but I did not want to have pudendal nerve entrapment. I had read about pudendal nerve entrapment in the early years after the onset of the pain, in places like this website, pudendalhope.org, which is the most depressing website I've ever visited. I heard a lot of horror stories about the surgery. I think a lot of people, it certainly did not work for everyone. Is my understanding was most people went to France. You had to have your butt cut open. Recovery was terrible, and a lot of people weren't even made better. So when Dr. Hibner diagnosed me, I was extremely resistant. So here's his criteria for diagnosing me. I had a traumatic mechanism of injury, right? So this can be surgery, it can be childbirth, it can be a fall. In my case, it was cycling. So a particular event that brought on the pain. Conservative treatments had failed. And one factor that supported the diagnosis is my pain had always been worse on one side. And statistically, entrapment is going to happen on one side and not the other, whereas just like irritation or just pelvic floor dysfunction would be throughout the pelvis, right? And my right side was much worse. There are exceptions to this. Like I definitely know people who had entrapment on both sides. So yeah, I told Dr. Hibner, I'm like, no, I don't have entrapment. And then I kind of thought about it and I sat or laid down with the diagnosis. And then I'm like, you know what? It's the only thing that makes sense. Like, it is the only thing that makes sense. It always made sense. Of course, this is what's going on. 11 years I've had this pain, and it's the only thing that makes sense. And I'm bedridden. Like, what do I have to lose if I get the surgery? So I got the surgery in September 2022. It was extremely expensive. Dr. Hibner doesn't take insurance, and this big hospital portion that was like $60,000. They billed my insurance and my insurance would not cover it because they said it was out of state. And there's 10 people in the world that perform this surgery, but they're like, oh, it's out of state. And once again, I am so lucky that I had the financial resources to have the surgery. Pudendal nerve entrapment is like almost impossible to treat if you don't have these incredible financial resources, and that needs to change immediately. It's an outrage.
Can I just pause a little bit about
Yeah.
to understand a bit more about the pudendal nerve entrapment, because I think it's not that well known or understood, even among people who are already familiar with pudendal neuralgia. So can you just explain what it actually is, and maybe also go into a bit more detail if you feel comfortable doing so about the decompression surgery and what that entails.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened in my case is so for a cyclist, and the pudendal nerve gets compressed by scar tissue. So this can be true in the wake of a surgery or childbirth. And or in the case of long distance cycling, it's a repetitive stress injury. And as it's been explained to me, it's a little bit like carpal tunnel, actually. So what happens is the pressure of your like groin, like your perineum against a hard bike seat, and mine was hard. Um, you know, it inflames the nerve. The nerve actually develops scar tissue
Mm,
around it to protect the nerve, paradoxically. But that scar tissue then compresses the nerve,
right.
causing pain and numbness in some people. So that's what happened. So my nerve wasn't just irritated as I thought, and it wasn't just pelvic floor muscle spasms, it was actual compression. And there's no way to diagnose compression other than taking a patient history is key and then actually going in there to see if the nerve is entrapped,
Mm,
which mine was at the entrance to the Alcock's Canal, which is very typical for a cyclist. I've been told the surgery lasted, I think it was maybe 4 hours. It was transgluteal. So they went in through the butt cheek. He went in through the butt cheek. He had to cut the sacrotuberous ligament, which he then kind of repaired afterwards. So to help with stability, he has innovated a lot of measures with from like wrapping the nerve in like placental tissue to actually rejuvenate it in these innovations that speed recovery.
mm,
One thing he did with me, which I found very helpful, was he implanted a Marcaine pain pump, which I wore on the outside of my body, it went in through the butt and delivered Marcaine continuously to the nerve. And that meant that the very night of my surgery, I could walk comfortably for the first time in a couple of years. So I woke up. Well, I woke up from surgery. I had surgical pain, which was different from pudendal neuralgia and which was controlled, by oxycodone. But my nerve actually felt great. And that lasted for 6 weeks after surgery. I was doing much better. The pain pump was in me for 2 weeks after surgery. And then after the pain pump fell out, I got another 4 weeks of relief because it's like it had calmed the nerve down. And then the pain came back at normal, at levels that it had been pre-surgery. Then starting 4 months after surgery, I began to see improvements, like sustained improvements, especially with standing and walking. Yeah. So does that answer your
yes,
question?
it does. That's really helpful context. Okay, so from that surgery, you were essentially not in pain anymore.
So I had 6 weeks of relief. I did have a kind of shooting muscle pain, which was very different, I think, which was an aftermath of the surgery. I controlled with oxycodone, was not nearly as bad as the pudendal neuralgia. And then then the pudendal neuralgia did come back after the effects of the pain pump had worn off. But then soon after that, I began to see improvement. I was going once a week to Dr. Weiss's former physical therapist. I was seeing her now, and she was really instrumental in recovery. She did, once again, these gentle internal vaginal trigger point release therapies. That was the only thing I allowed her to do. I didn't want her to touch any other part of my body, and I refused all kind of exercises because I knew that like my body gets flared so easily. So just stick with what works. And I did. I slowly got better over the course of 2023, so that by the end of 2023, I was walking again comfortably. I'm not talking about like long hikes, but I was walking again comfortably. I was able to sit for really longer than any period since 2011. And then I just kept getting better from there. And especially with sitting. I will say I was so weakened from the years being bedridden and from the lack of blood supply to the pelvis that I haven't gone on any long hikes or anything like that.
Mm.
But it did continue to get better and better. Perimenopause is really doing a number on my pelvis again. Not on my mobility, but it's kind of another story. But that I've also found the right treatment for that through Dr. Hibner. So, am I a perfect healed person? No. But my biggest regret in life is not having the decompression surgery many years earlier.
Mm. That's a powerful takeaway, I think, for listeners, especially when there's so much negative accounts of it, as you mentioned. online, that can really impact like the trajectory of your treatment pathway. Like it really matters. And it's a shame when, in your case, it seemed like it was the completely right thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. I wish that someone had told me in the first year, like,
Mm.
okay, physical therapy isn't working for you. Conservative treatments are failing. Here are the criteria for pudendal nerve entrapment. You might not want to get the surgery today. You might want to put it off 5 years or whatever, if you can live with your level of discomfort or work through it or whatever, but you do have the criteria for pudendal
Mm.
nerve entrapment. I wish someone had told me that. I wish someone had laid out, because my providers up until Dr. Weiss were not able to evaluate me in that same way. And I wish they had. I just wish it had been like mechanism of injury, like, if the pain is persisting and you're not able to live with that, um, you really are a good candidate for surgery. I just wish I'd known that.
I think you have a really powerful story because you have such a long period of being really, really ill and not finding the correct diagnosis and treatment, and then getting the surgery, which actually proved there was very much a physical cause
Mhm.
causing your pain. So I would love to kind of hear more from you about your views on pain science and psychologizing pain, especially in women, because you have some very interesting views on that. So would you mind sharing a little bit about your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I, as someone who's had trouble, say, with sitting and has needed to stand, and someone who then later on had trouble with mobility, I have found that when you have trouble with mobility, medicine views your pain different and is more likely to psychologize you, for the simple reason that we don't like people lying down in this culture. We like productive people. We see being bedridden as a psychological weakness, and I think there's something there, which is when my pain affected my mobility. I was treated differently by the medical community and also those around me in my personal life. And so I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Mm.
First of all, I want to say that I absolutely knew my pain had some kind of physiological um, etiology, because I'd gone so deep into somatic therapy and got as far as I could with that. So I was very adamant, like, this is not a mind brain thing.
Mm.
So what happened was I started hearing from those around me and from the medical community things like I was afraid of movement. I heard I have an unhealthy relationship to my pain because I stayed in bed. So I'll give you some examples. So when a pelvic floor physical therapist, who I haven't otherwise mentioned, this is another random physical therapist, saw me limping, she said, a quote, "Ask yourself, why do I feel like I have to walk like this?" Um, in order for Before I could be implanted with a dorsal root ganglion stimulator at UCSF at their pain clinic, they made me see a staff psychologist there for like an hour and a half interview. And I think this is very telling. If you need, say, an artificial joint in your knee or a pacemaker, no one makes you see a psychologist first, right? But I had to. So the psychologist asked all kinds of intrusive questions. She asked about my parents and whether they treated me well. And I was like, honey, I've been there. Um, she asked how much coffee I drank. For all of these, I sensed there was a right answer, right?
Yeah.
She asked about my movement patterns. And then she said something like, "Do you feel like you push yourself through pain or avoid it?" As if there's no middle ground. There's no healthy middle ground. And I literally said, like, is there a right answer? I couldn't help myself. But if there was a correct answer, I did not provide it,
Mm.
because in her notes, she said I had an unhelpful relationship to my pain and I was afraid of movement. And I found this extremely offensive because, my God, I had done so much work on
Mm.
myself. So another practitioner recommended the Curable app, and I downloaded it and I was horrified. So, and here I would like to quote briefly from an Instagram poster who goes by My Secret Life of Pain. She's amazing. She went far deeper into Curable than I did. And the things Curable, this pain app, told her are um, insane. So Curable told her that her brain had learned to, quote, fear weather patterns, physical activity, and certain foods. It told her your body has created a physical expression of something that's emotional. And I realized just now I apologize for using the word insane. That was not the right word, but it's infuriating is maybe a better
Mm,
word.
mm,
I told her it told her that her pain was her brain's way of throwing a temper tantrum and freaking out. My own worst experience with gaslighting came from someone very close to me in my personal life. This person had read up on so-called pain science, which is now a dominant discourse
mm,
in chronic pain studies, and they really thought my pain was psychogenic, was in my mind or my brain. And this person like repeated the line, which I've heard elsewhere, that I'm afraid of movement. They said I spent so much time, reclining because I liked the bed and the bath too much. They said I used a wheelchair out of anxiety. And even after my decompression surgery, they didn't believe the diagnosis. They still thought the pain was psychogenic. And their not believing me is just about the worst trauma of my life. It is so important to believe patients. It's so important for us to trust our own bodies, which I feel apps like Curable undermine our trust in our own bodies and our own experiences. This gaslighting is the opposite of what we need as
mm,
patients.
mm,
I will also say this person in my personal life, we're in a much better place right now, and they have apologized for the things they said. So, I'm a writer. As a comparative literature scholar, I love analyzing discourses and being like, what is this discourse and who is it serving, right? So as I was recovering from surgery, I got kind of deep into pain science, and I've written about this. I wrote an article in particular for Dame magazine on this, and also for Business Insider. So what I found is that today, like researchers, clinicians, pain psychologists generally view chronic pain as a quote unquote broken alarm system that comes to rule a patient's mind and nervous system. So in this model, catastrophizing thoughts and quote unquote avoidant behaviors are not byproducts of unresolved pain, but rather the causes of ongoing suffering. So I think a really good example is Dr. Rachel Zoffness, author of the Pain Management Workbook. So she argues in the Pain Management Workbook that chronic pain is brain driven and is a false alarm, your body's false alarm. So I find this focus on brain driven pain really interesting. And the first thing that came to mind when I did this reading is that it all sounds very scientific, right? If you
mm.
say something's in your mind or in your thoughts, it sounds less scientific. But if you say that it's brain driven,
Yes.
suddenly there's this veneer of scientific legitimacy that you have there. But if you look at, say, Courtney Zoffness's recommendations or Curable's recommendations for treating so-called brain-driven pain, the protocol is totally psychological. It's based on cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not new. It's very thought-based and it's very psychological. So they're saying the problem is in your brain, but the treatment is to alter your thoughts. That's psychology. That is not science. That's not hard science, right?
Mm,
So Zoffness says things like change out of your pajamas. If you stay in your PJs, your brain lingers in stick mode, like your brain lingers in sick mode, right? While getting dressed, quote, signals to your brain you're changing from disability to strength, from dysfunction to function. So if anything is helpful to a patient, I'm totally for it, right? I am obviously not opposed to, body mind modalities for helping to deal with chronic pain. And when pain is untreated, central sensitization can become an issue, right? But I distrust it when these modalities are passed off as hard science or as a cornerstone of treatment from your doctors, right? Coming from your doctors. So, how does Zoffness or anyone else know that chronic pain is a false alarm system? Experts agree that chronic pain is pain that persists more than 6 months. How many of us chronic pain patients have been correctly diagnosed at the 6-month mark, right?
mm.
So patients living with autoimmune conditions, migraines, fibromyalgia, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, endometriosis, vulvovaginal pain, it can take years to get the correct diagnosis. Yet, if our pain persists more than 6 months, and chances are it will because they're not the right tools to diagnose or treat us, suddenly we have a false alarm system and our pain is brain driven. So I was told my pain was brain driven and it was a false alarm system. But in fact, my body knew what the hell was happening. I had a physiological, what used to be called a lesion. I had um, a malfunction in my body that had nothing to do with my mind.
Mm.
So I think we need to really reevaluate how we talk about chronic pain. Chronic pain is not a monolith, right? The reasons we have chronic pain are highly disparate. Um, so I think what we need is to really just be careful. I dislike the term chronic pain in general, right? Like people have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, they have fibromyalgia, they have vulvovaginal pain. Conditions that, by the way, all of the conditions I name above affect primarily people with uteruses. And women's bodies are notoriously under-researched in medicine. As you've mentioned, Rachel E. Gross is great on this. So what we need is not workbooks, but more research, better diagnostic tools to treat these specific conditions.
Yeah.
Not profit-driven apps like Curable, right?
I really think you make a really elegant point here that chronic pain as a category kind of flattens this enormous diagnostic diversity into one single label. And the point you make around the classification of chronic pain as pain that has persisted for 6 months, or even in the UK where I got my diagnosis first, it's 3 months. That's a
Oh my
very short
gosh.
it's a very short amount of time. Even I was lucky enough to see private specialists, but if you're reliant on the public healthcare system, then you won't even get an appointment with a specialist within those 3 or 6 months. So I think that's a really
Right.
important point. And for pain science to fill that vacuum with psychological explanation before we've invested in actually understanding what drives these conditions is simply not good enough. And I think you make that point so well. And there's also, I think, just a very big lack of humility in the process of understanding chronic pain very much from the lens of pain science, because the fact of the matter is, like, a very few handful of specialists actually understand these conditions and are able to accurately diagnose a woman in a relatively short period of time. So the whole way in which we view this chronic pain, and now in the context of pelvic pain or vulvovaginal pain, is just flawed. So I think it's a really elegant argument that you make. And I also really appreciate and want to make sure that we're not losing something which is also, I think, a very important nuance here, in that you have a position where, you did somatic work. It helped you, like embodied meditation, trauma release work. These were important parts of your story as you share. So the question isn't whether mind-body approaches have value. The question is something else. And that is that, yeah, can you articulate a bit more about this, the difference between being imposed the mind-body work versus actually selecting yourself as something that you would like to work on? Because you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to say that, I correspond with a lot of women who have vulvovaginal pain, and I don't know a single one who hasn't tried to be in therapy for it, who hasn't done all of the work, right? I think so. First of all, I will say that in my mind, therapy, meditation, right, like workbooks can be helpful to support any illness because illnesses are really traumatic, right? And they can bring up a lot of stuff for the sufferer. So I think that those, any kind of mind body modality has a role, first of all, in supporting patients through the trauma of being in pain, of navigating the medical system, of having fatigue, whatever it is. I think those are great tools. I also believe that they do have calming, these kinds of modalities, meditation and so on, can help calm the nervous system. And that's always great, especially for pain conditions like mine, right? That have to do with the nerve. So I absolutely do believe, as you said, there's a role for kind of whatever kind of mind body modality you're drawn to. And it might be someone's faith or whatever it is, just a kind of support system for the mind body. But that's different from a pseudo-scientific protocol that comes from researchers and clinicians themselves, which advocates, pain reeducation, brain reeducation, pain science, and that uses that model in lieu of other other uh, other protocol, other treatments. And I think it really goes back to that problem with the chronic pain diagnosis, right? And the idea that pain science has found a cure for chronic pain when the very definition of chronic pain and how we see it is flawed, right? I also think the risk of pain science education and curable, the risk of it is that it's trying to tell you that your body is not telling you the truth or your mind is not telling you the truth. And I think that's, for me, that makes me very wary because
Mm.
my journey into somatic therapy really does the opposite. It's really about learning to trust your body and listen to your body. And for me, as a vulnerable woman and pain patient, that is a message that's really resonated with me. On the other hand, like if the chronic pain workbook or the pain management workbook works for you, anything that works is great. Like, I'm all for anything that works.
Mhm.
So you and I have talked a little bit about the so-called biopsychosocial model.
Mm.
I think that the idea that this, like, oh, experts have discovered that pain is biopsychosocial. Well, like, kind of like, no shit, Sherlock,
Mm.
Of course it is. What happens though in practice is that this psycho portion is what gets emphasized.
Mm.
And the psycho portion puts the onus of change on a patient who's already really struggling, right? And is trying to navigate a labyrinthine healthcare system and so on. And I would advocate for something more like a social biopsycho approach that
Mhm.
puts the burden of change on, first of all, the healthcare system. I'm all for the healthcare system doing biopsychosocial modalities for themselves, right? As you said, like practicing, humility, like epistemic humility, knowing what it doesn't know, funneling far more research dollars into treating women's pain and understanding the bodies of people with uteruses. And our insurance system is totally messed up. As you said, it can take anywhere. It can, whether it's in the UK or here or Canada, it takes so long to even see a doctor. There are so many problems with the medical system. And really, how dare they say that it's like the psycho, like we need to change ourselves
Mm.
rather than having this kind of widespread reform. Of course, it sounds easier to make the individual just change herself.
Mm.
And it is empowering also to think you can change yourself, but we're really missing the whole picture here, which is that, if I'm gonna change something, it's not gonna be doing a workbook. It's going to be through advocacy, right? And getting involved. And at this point, I want that outward focus
Mm.
that can start to change the system.
Carli, thank you so much, genuinely, for coming on and not only sharing your story, which is so powerful, and you've explained it in such detail and really painted the picture of your story, which for me was very emotional to hear. So thank you for doing that and for doing the work that you're doing in terms of patient activism on this. It really matters. And also thank you for sharing your views on, I think, like how medicine fails a particular type of patient. I'm just very grateful to be able to tap into your whip-smart mind and hear your thoughts on this.
And I'm so grateful for this chance. And yeah, it's been lovely to talk with you. And I love your podcast. I'm so glad that your voice is out there. So
Thank you,
keep it up.
Carli. I appreciate it. Where can people find you if they want to follow your work or connect with you?
I do have a website, carlicutchin.com. And also, I do a lot of stuff on Instagram. So that's
Mm.
also just my handle is Carli Cutchin, first name, last name.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll link all of that in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time, Carli.
Okay, thank you so much.
I hope that conversation gave you as much to sit with as it gave me, both in terms of Carli's story and the bigger questions she raises about how we think about chronic pain and what gets missed when the frameworks aren't quite right. If anything in this episode resonated, I'd really encourage you to find Carli's writing. She covers chronic pain and disability with this depth and clarity that is genuinely rare, and I'll link to her work in the show notes. And if you're someone who's been navigating this for a long time without answers, I hope this was a useful reminder that there are still questions worth asking. I'll see you next week.